Hi, folks. Welcome to our weekly chat here, talking about local history. Thanks for joining me again, and thank you so much for the feedback. Getting some great comments, not only on through the comment section or private messages, but I was at the grocery store and someone stopped me, and the barber shop, and someone had talked about a recent discussion that we had. So, thanks for that feedback and giving me some great ideas for future topics. Unfortunately, I'm only doing this once a week, and there are more topics than I have weeks, so hopefully I'll get to a lot of these ideas sooner than later. But this week I want to talk about Halloween. It's coming up in a week, and I know a lot of you folks don't watch live, so I wanted to do it a week ahead because I didn't want it to be anticlimactic after Halloween when most of you might have watched it if I were to do it next week. But behind me, I have, and actually here too, these cool vintage. You might remember some of these vintage Halloween decorations. Um, I've kind of stolen them from my living room to show you because these were my mother's, and I still put them up. And I thought it'd be kind of neat to, since we talk about history, to have some historic Halloween decorations. And some of you might have these around. And actually, there's companies that are making replicas of them because people have such fond memories of these old cardboard cutout Halloween decorations, and they'll sell them. But these are genuine ones, and I'm really proud of them. So that's why I want to share them with you. But the topic of Halloween is interesting, and I've been trying to do, as a lot of you might agree, and I've been trying to do a lot of research into it because it's very fascinating how the holiday and the traditions associated with it have evolved. And if you look up online about the history of Halloween, you'll hear about ancient pagan rituals and holidays and Celtic holidays, and how a lot of the Halloween things that we do today evolve out of that. That's well and good, but I'm more concentrating on even the evolution that's happened in the last 100 years or so, and how we celebrate Halloween. And as I was digging through, and I wrote last year about Halloween vandalism, and how a lot of us might feel like it's those darn kids today. And actually, today our vandalism is way less on Halloween than what has been in the past, mostly because the community has cracked down on it after an incident in 2002, I believe it was. But in any event, the tricks have been actually more part of Halloween than the treats. And throughout the history, even back into the late 1800s, the police have warned here in East Aurora and local communities all across the country to avoid the mischief. But the mischief seems to happen. And the article that I wrote last year was about how during World War II they had very quiet Halloweens because the police and the community, the school, all but begged and made a plea to local teenagers to not get involved in any property damage on Halloween, which had sort of become a tradition, because doing so would take resources away from the war effort, and then by doing that, you were being anti-patriotic, and it worked. So much so that in 1946, the first Halloween after the war had ended, um, the for all intents and purposes, the first Halloween. It the Halloweens right after the war, so several Halloweens were the worst when it came to property damage. So the teenagers were right back at it after the war because that whole sense of patriotism had gone away. But as I was investigating that and researching that history, about vandalism in the community on Halloween, I got to thinking about trick or treating, and I actually asked I have a couple folks, believe it or not, a couple friends, one in particular who I ask quite often, who are approaching 100 years old, and whenever I have a question about something or about what was happening when they were kids, World War II sort of era, I just ask them. So I was researching 1923. I came across 1923 seems to be the first year that East Aurora held a big blowout party on Halloween. So much so, in fact, they called it a Halloween frolic. Um, and Boy Scouts and a bunch of other civics groups got together that year, and it seems to be the first one. There had been Halloween parties at the Roycroft and in churches and things before that, but a big, huge party in East Aurora, um, a street party, a street carnival was held. They had a big parade down Main Street. Everybody was encouraged to wear their costumes. And the parade ended on Grove Street, South Grove, right in front of the Roycroft, between Main and Oakwood, and they blocked the road off. And they had a big carnival, and there were stunt performers. There was costume contests, and the bands played, music played, um, uh, and the newspaper covered it, and it was a big, big event. And it was so successful that the next year they held it again. And it seems the American Legion here in East Aurora took over the event, and there was for decades, more than 30 years at least, there was a Halloween parade, and then they moved the event inside to at the was the high school at the time, today the middle school, and they handed out treats, showed movies, Halloween themed movies. One of the things that I noticed was missing, and the reason I asked my nearly 100-year-old friends about this was trick or treating. There was no mention in the newspaper about trick or treating, and so I asked my friend who was approaching 100 years old. I said, "What was trick or treating like when you were young?" And of course, this friend would have graduated high school in the 1940s, so would have been young in the late 20s and throughout the 30s. And she just shook her head and was like, "We didn't do trick or treating. I don't remember trick or treating." And it blew my mind because we associate trick or treating so much with Halloween that it's hard to imagine, right? The holiday without it. While doing a little digging, I found, and a lot of historians who've looked into it have found, if you just go online and look, that trick or treating is a very new phenomena. And it has its origins actually going back to Thanksgiving traditions where children would go around, quote unquote, begging for treats and food. Um, but and then there were a lot of origins that they're trying to place ancient origins to trick or treating. But the modern trick or treating has came around about 100 years ago, and it is believed that it sort of came through Canada. That's one theory. They looked through old newspaper articles to see. Historians look through old newspaper articles trying to find the first mentions of trick or treating. And they seemed to figure out that it was in Canada. They found it in newspapers. And then it came through the northern United States. And then what really changed it was the early 1950s. There was a tradition of trick or treating that started to grow after World War II. It's believed it may have started before that. World War II, they didn't, and during the Great Depression, they weren't obviously, when you're coming out of the Great Depression, even if it did started before that in other towns, it wouldn't have been a good thing to go around begging for doing trick or treating for all intents and purposes during World War II or coming out of the Great Depression. So it really picked up in on a localized level after World War II. But what really happened was the media. So Peanuts is actually Charles Schulz and the Peanuts specials of Halloween, where they mention the practice of trick or treating. So if you were a child watching a special on trick or treating, or a special on Halloween, and they mentioned trick or treating, and you didn't have it happening in your community, you'd start asking questions, right? So it spread, and then the year later, apparently Disney put out a special and had trick or treating in it, and there were children's magazines published with trick or treating and trick or treaters on the cover. So it spread very quickly. Before that, and we have at the archives in the town historian's office some early Halloween postcards that are actually on exhibit right now if you want to see them in the town hall. That there's no trick-or-treaters on them. So from the 1910s and 1920s, they're more romanticized greetings, finding love on Halloween, or you're my, sending you a loving message on Halloween, and it would have a person dressed up in costume. So that tradition was happening, costume parties. But there were no trick-or-treating. You will not find on vintage postcards and publications before the 1930s at the very least, but certainly after more so it came along after World War II. So imagine you're a kid or you're a parent of kids and you see this stuff in the media, and even if it wasn't happening in your community, you would be like, well, what's this trick-or-treating thing? And it came according to historians, it kind of after World War II in the early 1950s, it spread very quickly and became very, very popular very, very quickly. I've been trying, and this is one of the things I'm out of my comfort zone a little, because I usually don't try to talk about things I haven't researched thoroughly, and I haven't in this case. And so I'm hoping that people will respond with more information, because I want to write about this. But I've been doing research, and I researched into the East Aurora Advertiser editions, and it appears that East Aurora, our local town's history of trick-or-treating, follows the national trend. For instance, the popularity of trick-or-treating in the 1950s nationally from those media things, the Peanuts special and the magazines, the children's magazines that featured it. The first mention I found of trick-or-treating in the Easter Advertiser was in 1953, and it actually was connected to UNICEF. And the collection of the churches got together, and the children would go out and collect coins for UNICEF. And you probably remember those if you're of my age or older, where the kids would go around collecting money for the less fortunate. And so that's the first mention, 1953, of what I can find is the words trick-or-treating in the newspaper, and that follows the trend that was happening nationally. As I said before, the American Legion held an annual parade and events, and then the Boys Club, which is now the Boys and Girls Club, held a party for teenagers, and then vandalism and mischief was part of Halloween. But you can see a trend as the 1950s went on and into the 1960s, where these parties, these costume parties and community parties, sort of fell to the wayside. There was no big announcement in the paper, but anecdotally, that's kind of what I was seeing, where they went away as trick-or-treating became more popular. And so by the end of the 1950s, you start seeing in the newspapers mention of trick-or-treating, not only associated with UNICEF and the collection for UNICEF, but also for trick-or-treating itself, collecting candy and going door to door in your costume. So by the late 50s, that was being mentioned in the paper. By the time you got into the 1960s, a lot of these community parties, you didn't see the big parade down Main Street anymore. But what the Kiwanis Club did actually, which was kind of an interesting project, and starting in 1962, was that they had a candy give back program, essentially, where they asked kids to bring their candy to either the school at first, and then the churches started doing it, where they would bring their extra candy for children who couldn't go out trick-or-treating. And so by the early 1960s, trick-or-treating had become so popular that the Kiwanis Club in this case had a program to include all children in it. So by the 1960s, trick-or-treating had become an institution when it came to Halloween. 1950s, 1960s is when when it really grew, and a lot of it had to do with media. And you'll read about the candy bar companies were pushing it through advertising because they wanted you to buy their candy bars. Halloween specials were coming out, children's Halloween specials and movies and trick-or-treating is part of it. So I learned it was I just couldn't imagine Halloween today coming from East Aurora, especially in a neighborhood where we have upwards of 900 to 1,000 trick-or-treaters. Imagine Halloween here in East Aurora without trick-or-treating. But again, there are people who theoretically, well, not even theoretically, who are that I know of, who are alive today, who when they were children, trick-or-treating wasn't part of Halloween. So I was just kind of blown away by that holiday that is so entwined with this activity of trick or treating that the holiday existed before, and they weren't certainly bored. The Easter Roy had a big celebration, but trick or treating wasn't a part of it. So I haven't really nailed down when trick or treating actually started. The newspaper records don't seem to have it in there. They talk a lot about vandalism that occurred, those mischievous teenagers who caused trouble on Halloween, dating back to the 1880s, actually. And each year they would report on that. But I'm having trouble finding a specific mention of when trick or treating actually started as an activity here in our community, and by extension other communities. Now this trick or treating thing with UNICEF, that wasn't just an East Aurora thing. It was nationwide, but also little communities, because churches were operating this program. Each community, even the smallest ones, so in Marilla, out in Wales, the surrounding communities, the little neighborhoods, the kids went out. And so it just wasn't the village. The kids would go out in their own little neighborhoods and collect money and candy as a result, and trick or treat starting in the 1950s. Actually, the UNICEF program started in 1950. So I would love to hear from anybody who may have either know somebody or themselves. I don't know if I have anybody approaching 100 years old listening, but I'd love to hear stories that either confirm or maybe add a little more details to the history of trick or treating specifically here in our community. And if you trick or treated when you were a kid, and maybe your memories of it, and maybe how it changed over time. One of the things I did find interesting is the Halloween parties that were held. If Halloween landed on a Sunday, um, hardly anything was done on what they considered the Sabbath on a Sunday. So like even if the 4th of July landed on a Sunday, they would have the celebration either on the 5th or the 3rd. Same with Halloween. It was usually held the Saturday before if Halloween landed on a Sunday. Nowadays, we just do it on Halloween in most cases, regardless of the day it lands. So things like that, and if anyone does remember when we started trick-or-treating, or if anyone out there remembers being around for Halloween when there wasn't trick-or-treating, I'd love to hear it. So either send me a private message, put it in the comments, or stop me at the grocery store if you have any insight into that. I'd be intrigued because I do want to write about it. What's great about doing these videos is I can just kind of talk about things a little more less formal. But when I write, I want to make sure I have things footnoted and have things. That's one of the things I really like to do, and most historians like to do, is to make sure that the dates are correct and any details we can possibly do are hammered down. So this is a little less formal. So I can be like, I don't know some of the details of this. So again, any trick-or-treating history you can give me, bring it on. Either put it in the comments or let me know when you see me out and about. Again, thanks for joining me. Happy Halloween. Enjoy the holiday. Enjoy the trick-or-treating here in East Aurora. Halloween has become a big deal in East Aurora. The Halloween displays, you can take a tour around East Aurora and see all the Halloween displays. So Halloween has always been a big deal, but it seems like in the last couple of years, especially since COVID, that we've embraced it here in East Aurora as part of the Halloween history, in addition to the trick-or-treating on Halloween night. Again, I am the Town and Village historian, but these videos are, and a lot of the research I do are not affiliated with my official position as the Town and Village historian. Just the caveat for these videos. And again, if you have any comments, any ideas, I can't get to them right away necessarily, but I love to hear your ideas and your feedback. Either put them in the comments or send me a private message. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll see you next time, next Tuesday, or if you're not watching live, anytime. You can watch them either on the Facebook page or our YouTube page. And again, thanks for the support of this project. I really appreciate it. We'll see you next time, and thanks for keeping history alive.